Good morning. My name is Eduardo Rosa Molinar. Um, while you're here, while we're here, you guys can call me Ed. My name's a mouthful, and I welcome you to this session that called "Advancing Your Career Through Effective Science Writing for the Public and Creating Eye-Catching Research Statements." So I just want to tell you a quick story of how this whole crazy idea started. We Last year we were at the neuroscience meetings. We were kind of standing around. So I'm a circuit neuroscientist. So I know nothing about writing, uh, except I know how to write grants and I know how to do the things that we do. And you're gonna see some really cool things. But basically, I hooked up with these three fantastic individuals. We have Paula Clifford over here, and then we have Wendy Jarrett, and then Jim Newman. We were kind of brainstorming, and I was saying how sometimes even in my lab, teaching people how to write and communicating is difficult. And English is my second language, so as you will see, in writing in English is something that I'm trying to constantly improve. Even though I'm a professor and everything else, we're still constantly trying to improve and to better the way that we do things. Well, what was kind of interesting about this is that they came up with it. We started brainstorming. I said, wouldn't it be great to actually, you know, talk about this thing? Because a lot of people basically believe that grammar is a good way of writing, but basically being clear and being and articulating what we do is actually something important. And after reviewing several years of reviewing grants, one of the things that became obvious is that when you write these proposals, particularly when you write specific games, you're writing these proposals for yourselves. And what you tend to forget is that if you're lucky, if one member in that review panel is actually an expert in your area. So actually writing clear, concise, and very simple ways of articulating your science is actually a very important step. And this is why this idea of coming together and actually uh, presenting this topic to you. So, like I said, I know nothing about writing English, and you're going to see I really suck at it. And with that, I'm going to actually let Paula actually come up here and actually tell you why we're going to be what we're doing here today. Paula.
Thanks, Ed, for introducing and welcoming everybody. I'm Paula Clifford. I'm the Executive Director for Americans for Medical Progress. And just so you know, we're a nonprofit organization that supports responsible science. And a lot of what we do is help educate the public about the role of animals in research as well. So I'm just curious out there, how many of you work with animals as part of your research? Wow, most of you. Okay, so we are going to provide some tips on that area as well, on how do you communicate the role of animals in your work, especially if a public audience or somebody outside your discipline is reading it. So just so you know, where a little bit about me, I'm not a writer. Thank goodness Jim, my colleague, is part of our group. But I do have a lot of experience in outreach. So I do a lot with educating the public. I've done a lot in K through 12 classrooms and talking with students as well as undergraduates and graduate students. And then now a lot of what I do is I work with researchers as well as institutions on how to engage with the public and communicate that work clearly. So public support, as you probably know, is essential to continuing the advancement of medicine and science as we know it. So that is why this topic is really important to me and to most of us up here, is that, as Ed had mentioned, writing clearly is really a critical part of what we need to do. Every person in this room does have a responsibility to educate the public about science, about the work that you're doing. And you can do that in a lot of different ways. You can do it in formal, outreach efforts. There's lots of things happening at institutions or through organizations like mine that really help you participate in outreach programs to actively engage the public. but you can also do that in the day-to-day stuff that you do, in your writing, in the things that you might be doing and writing your research statement and things like that. So there's all levels of that. So today you have a panel of experts, and they are going to provide you in this 2 hours with practical advice on how to effectively write about science. That's the goal of today. So just so you know, we are going to focus on general writing, but we will also provide some tips on what you might be including in your research statements and how that looks. Because as Ed had mentioned, your writing should be very clear and understandable by public audiences or anybody that's outside your discipline. So if you can clearly communicate the importance of what you're doing, you're sort of going to have a better chance in getting that funding or getting that job and those kinds of things. So what it's going to look like today is the first hour of here. You'll hear some of that practical advice, and we'll walk you through some of those things. We'll have some interaction. If you have questions, make sure you raise your hand, and we can clearly, clarify whatever you have the question about. And then for the second hour, we're actually going to move to the tables in the back and do some writing. So that way you'll walk away with something that's written that you can continue to expand upon. And as part of that, there'll be a lot of back and forth. So we'll share what we're writing. So hopefully you have something to write with, or a computer, or whatever. If not, we'll make sure that you're set up. So from there, I think we're just about ready to get started. So I'm going to ask Wendy to come on up and introduce herself, and then talk about some examples of successful science writing.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you. So I'm Wendy Jarrett. I work in the UK for Understanding Animal Research, and we're a very similar organisation to Americans for Medical Progress in that we help the public. We aim to help the public to understand why and how animals are used. And more importantly, we support organisations in the UK to communicate that work with the public. So I thought I'd start with some examples of what we consider to be good science writing. And as Paula said, we will be talking specifically about research statements and how you might put those together later on in the session. But this is from the Oxford University website, and I've put the link up there. I won't go to it now, but if you want to check it out later, you can see that this website has a whole load of case studies on the website to explain the sort of science that's going on, the research that's going on at the university. But this is one example. It gives you, it encapsulates at the top what the research is all about, what they want to find out about the brain processes involved in decision making, and then it tells you which animals are used in that research. And then Professor Matthew Rushworth goes on to talk about what he's trying to find out. And this is very much written for a public audience. As you can see, we're trying to understand the basic processes in the brain that allow us to make decisions. For example, you've got to make decisions just coming into work in the morning. Do you stop at the traffic lights, or do you go through a red light? Those sorts of decisions that you're making as you go through. And then he goes on to try to explain, using a metaphor really, or an analogy. At the bottom, the bottom paragraph there, the brain is a mosaic with different areas doing different tasks. And if you lose a tile out of that mosaic, then there's a way that some of the other tiles can take over, but it doesn't necessarily work in the same way. For instance, if somebody has a stroke, or you want to find out how to make those tiles fit together again to keep that mosaic as a whole. This is an example, again, this is very, very simple stuff from the Jackson Lab, who create genetically modified and other mice for research. And they have a great site, and I'd really recommend that you have a look at this, called Minute to Understanding. And each of these videos, and if you scroll down the page, there are lots more, each of them it literally is a minute or just under, explaining really quite complex subjects. So epigenetics or gene therapy, for the public in less than a minute. And those are videos with somebody speaking to them. So again, it's a good example of how to provide information in a very simple way. This is another US example about somebody who uses birds in her research, in this case sparrows. And we really like the way she started this out. To some people, the house sparrow is a cute little bird. To others, it's an invasive species, but for me, it's the focus of my research. And she goes on to talk about the way that she's using the sparrows to look at how different neurotransmitters and hormones help animals to find a mate and to escape predators, etc. So it's a very clear, nicely written, accessible piece there for a public audience. This is from a research charity. So sometimes, certainly in the past, charities that are depending on public money have been quite reticent about talking about why they use or whether they use animals in research. And this is the British Heart Foundation in the UK, obviously from the name. And they're very clear that they need to, that what they're set up for is to save human lives. But in doing that, they use some animals in their research. So where there are no feasible alternatives, we fund research involving animals as part of a broad spectrum of science that ranges from laboratory studies to clinical trials in patient volunteers. And what you'll see there is they don't have any jargon words. They don't say cardiovascular, I don't think. They talk about heart and circulatory. They're using terms, simplified terms that the public can understand. So if you're doing a piece of work, a piece of writing, as Ed was saying, where the chances are you've got one person reviewing that piece of writing who actually understands your area of research, it helps you a lot if the rest of the panel can understand clearly straight away what it is you're trying to do. And that's the rest of that, that study, that piece of information on their website. So they're using, for instance, studying how the heart develops in mice and fish to understand what can go wrong with babies that have heart defects. So I'll now hand over to Ed for perhaps some less successful science writing.
Okay, so like I told you initially, my English is not my native language. So as I studied in the mainland and I went to school in Puerto Rico, and basically as I've actually learned how to become more efficient in writing. One of my big problems is in Spanish we have we write extremely long sentences and we do really complicated things. I like punctuation, all of the bad things they were not supposed to do as writers, right? So what I'm going to do is here with that, I want to introduce you to this statement here, and I'm going to let Jim actually do this. So you can read this, right? This is basically a research statement that I basically, believe it or not, I have this up on my website. It's pretty embarrassing, but I want to use this actually as a way of actually showing you what not to do.
Ed, would you be willing to read it to us?
Okay, all right. Eduardo is a circuit neuroscientist working on the development and application of tools and workflows for multi-scale, multimodal, correlative volume microscopies and three-dimensional volume reconstruction to unravel the molecular diversity, geometry, and niche specialization of gap junction proteins connexins in electrical synapses in vertebrates, specifically fish, in which efficient transgenesis and revolutionary, and it goes on and on and on, right? Oh. So you could actually see this is not a cool thing, right? So then it goes on to say electrical synapses are abundant throughout the vertebrate central nervous system, are essential components of neurocircuitry, and contribute to local and long-range circuitry functions. Electrical synapses have been proposed to contribute to the cause of autism and epilepsy, and to facilitate neurodegeneration and brain injuries. Eduardo is a tenured professor, blah, 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 blah. Okay, all right. So now I'm going to let Jim, who's our English person, actually tear this apart.
Well, I was thinking maybe we could do a show of hands. So how many of you believe that the writing is clear for a broad audience? Raise of hands if you think this is clearly written so that people of all ages could understand it. Who believes that it's a little bit too thick for the majority of the general public, by raise of hands? Who believes the sentences are a little bit long? By show of hands. Let's see, what else can we ask here? How many of you believe the structure of it is right? So, is it, a news story is typically a structure of the big picture and then sort of the details. Is it structured in a way that's understandable? If you believe that, raise your hand. So we got a couple. So those are the key issues I see with it. And we thank you to Ed for giving us this example, because it is actually a representative example, I'd say, of what we might see in science writing.
Right. Can I point some? Does anybody see anything good in there? Something that really sort of, that you could clearly felt like sort of a gem in there? Yes, in the purple.
I like the fact that when you talk about like the electrical synapses and it connects to other things that you do know, like autism and epilepsy, that's something that's common. You're like, yeah, I get it. I can connect that.
I love that too. Yeah. Electrical synapses have been proposed to contribute the cause of autism and epilepsy and to facilitate neurodegeneration in brain injuries. That was beautiful. So thanks for that connection, Ed, and thank
Okay.
you for pointing that out.
Let me give you my favorite part. So here's the beginning of sentence one, and then the ending of sentence one is here. We actually did a word count to find out how long sentence one is. Anybody who believes it's 30 words or higher, raise your hand. Anyone who believes it's 50 words or higher, raise your hands. It's actually 61 words. And I was hoping it might be a world record, but unfortunately it's not. So as a writer, and that's a problem that many of us just as writers have, is that, we'll write something, we'll write a first draft, and we'll have this great thought. It'll just come out, very fluid, and it'll seem like it's straightforward. But then upon further review, you realize that it needs to be broken into separate sentences into separate thoughts to help the general public understand. And I think that's certainly something that if we were to take this and, for the lack of a better word, translate this for a more general audience, that's certainly one of the things we would do. We would take the language, we'd make it less complex. We would break it up into smaller chunks. We would, we'd have to define some terms. It would probably be a little bit longer, perhaps. But there's the structure of it, actually, that it's there for the most part. Big story, little details, but we need to tinker with it a little bit. But it's a good example of what we see in science writing. Is it my part of the section? Okay.
Yeah, and I just want to point one more thing too. It's very good to see that you didn't mention the animal that was involved in your research. So
Yes.
another good thing about that statement.
So we said the first sentence is 61 words long. This morning we looked up to see how long the average U.S. English sentence is in the English language. It's about 15 to 20. So I applaud Edward for tripling the average. How do we get to this? Is it you? Okay, so I'm going to jump back and let Wendy talk again, and we'll come back to me later.
I noticed that you wrote in the third person. Is it okay, or should we write?
I think it very much depends on the piece of writing that you're doing. So if you're saying, probably if it's your own personal statement, you would be saying, I do this, I am such and such, and I do this, and what I'm looking for and what I'm hoping for in the future. If you're doing something for a website or something more publicly available, you might want to say, Eduardo does this research, this is what he's aiming to do. So it depends on the audience, it depends on the reason why you're writing the piece in the first place. But either work. You probably wouldn't use the second person, but first or third is fine, I think. So this was really, I'm going to give a very high level idea of what the components of effective science writing are, and then Jim's going into a lot more detail about use of different forms of writing as you go forward. So really what you're doing essentially is telling a story. You're either telling a story to people from the public, or you're telling the story of your research to the people who are judging you in your judging your research statement or looking at your grant panel application or whatever it might be. And so you need to think about the story you want to tell. You need to start off with sort of putting that in context. What have you done in the past? What was the big question that you set out to answer? What's your ultimate goal? What did you find? What have you found so far? and what's your research contributed to the field generally. And then what you bring it to the present, what are you currently working on? What are you now actively trying to solve? Which questions are you trying to answer? How have you got on? Where have you got to so far? Again, taking it back out to the bigger picture, what are the larger implications of your work? And then looking to the future, what would you like to do in the future? What further questions perhaps that have come up in what you're doing at the moment? What further questions have come up that you'd like to solve in the future? And how would you intend to go about finding those answers? And when you're writing a piece, make sure that it flows, make sure that you show progression through what you're saying. So you go from the past, the present, the future. You can see the flow in that. It's quite logical. And try to tie the various sections together so there's a sort of link between each section. And then I think the subtext there, what's the primary question again? What are you hoping to do over your career? And why is it important? And how is each stage related to that question? Keep bringing it back to that overall question. And if you can, try to explain what you're doing with examples that people will understand. So I mentioned in that first piece of research writing that I showed, the notion of, do you stop at the traffic lights or you just drive through them? Or when something goes wrong with the brain, how does it try to rebuild that mosaic that it needs to be, even though one of the tiles might be missing? Those sorts of analogies, and I know Jim will come back to that later. And this is a point I think that Ed was making as well, is your statement needs to include all the information that the reader needs in order to understand what you're doing. You can't rely on them having read all your past work or understood your past papers or anything like that, or necessarily understand in depth the field that you're writing about. So you need to prepare people give them all the information they need to be able to understand what your research is all about. And then when you're thinking about writing for the public specifically, it's important to think about that. Your audience is not your peers necessarily in this sort of writing. So they don't have a scientific background. They're not necessarily scientifically literate. So you're looking really to pitch your writing, when you're talking about public statements, to a smart 12-year-old. And that is generally accepted as being the sort of average reading age of the population. So if you know any smart 12-year-olds, you can practice on them. But think about, as you're writing, would my nephew or my son or whoever understand this piece of work that I'm writing? Would your non-neuroscience friends or neighbours understand what you've written? I often, when I'm doing media training with people, I say, imagine you're explaining this to your grandmother, unless, of course, your grandmother is a research scientist. So I put non-neuroscientist in there to make sure that we're not being too slack on that one. Avoid the jargon, avoid the acronyms. You know what they mean. All your peers know what they mean. When you put them on your posters, or if you're doing a presentation here, you can get away with using those jargon and acronym terms. But you can't when you're talking to the general public, because they just don't understand what you're talking about, and then you lose them. They stop reading, they stop being interested. Eduardo just demonstrated this point. Your sentences should be short. Really try to keep to no more than 15 to 20 words in a sentence. If you're going beyond that, then think, how can I break this into two or more sentences? It doesn't necessarily need to be one long stream of consciousness. And try to keep to one main idea in a sentence. So if you're tempted to put in a subclause in the middle of it, then try to take that subclause out and put it into a separate sentence, and just keep the main point that you were trying to make in your first sentence in a single one. And use active verbs rather than passive verbs. Say, the mouse may feel discomfort, rather than discomfort may be felt by the mouse. Science is very good at writing in the passive voice. This may be happening. But if you can make it active, it's much more accessible to the public to understand really what you're talking about. And make sure you give yourself enough time. It's actually harder to write in simple lay language than it is to use the language that you're used to using all the time. And I just finished with this quote. I don't know whether you can read it there. It's from Pascal, although sometimes it's attributed to Mark Twain, so you may have heard it that way as well. If I'd had more time, I would have written a shorter letter. And that's really very apposite for this sort of writing. You do need to allow yourself enough time to do it. And I'll hand back to Jim.
So let me begin by just a brief introduction. I'm Jim Newman. I'm also with Americans for Medical Progress. I'm the communications director. But in a past life, I was a communications director at a couple of different institutions at Oregon Health and Science University and also MD Anderson Cancer Center. And I bring that up because whenever somebody used to ask me what I did for a living, I gave them my title, but I also basically explained that I considered myself a science translator. And, taking some very complex science, often I was writing about basic science, taking that science, translating it for the public so that, the guy down the street who picks up the garbage could understand what we're talking about. And I think that's what we're really doing here today is we're taking your research, which like the back of your hand, and you can write 61-word sentences about. We want to take that and make it palatable to a wide variety of audiences, from highly educated individuals in another field to maybe even classroom students. And I think it's a lot easier said than done. And Wendy talked a little bit about some of the tips for doing that. And what I wanted to get into is the actual writing process, because as a longtime writer, I used to work in the news media, but I've also been doing science writing for a while. And you sort of learn some tricks of the trade, some process that make it a lot easier, because sometimes it's difficult just to sit down in front of a computer and just jot things out, as they exist in your brain. They're convoluted. You start at the end, you go backwards. So I think it's helpful to talk about the writing process and at least the process that I use. And everybody has a little bit of a different process, but these are the steps that I tend to use. So I certainly think about the audience first, and some of this is going to reflect on things that were mentioned by Wendy, but this is sort of how we use them in practice. So I always think about, are they your peers? Are you writing for the general public? Are you writing for fifth grade students? Who are you writing to? Because of course the language you use varies quite a bit in those instances. And then, it also depends on sort of what are you going to put up front. If you're talking to a group of fifth graders, you might say, my research is aimed at understanding why we get thirsty, or, it might be something that they can understand. That's a very simple concept. So once you've defined your audience, think about how deep is their science vocabulary. Am I going to have to explain what DNA is, or is that just is my audience smart enough to understand what that is? If it's unknown, of course, you have to go for that 12th grade reading level, which is, as a former news writer, that's what we are always shooting for, is that sort of that, higher elementary, lower junior high school age. And then also a big question to ask ourselves is how much of an appetite our audience has, because they may be a very well-educated audience, but their interest is maybe minimal. And so, we have that tendency to sit down with somebody like at a dinner table and they ask what you do and you just give them everything. And you have to recognize that it's better to give people small pieces of information, at least up front, and sort of capture them that way versus, giving them a 10-page summary of what you do. And another consideration, and I think this is really important, whenever you're writing an opinion piece, so whenever I'm writing an editorial in the newspaper, the big question that we always want to answer is, what is our ask? What are we asking people for? And I really think that's the case for all types of writing, is what do you want from your audience? Do you want your audience to walk away with a general understanding about your research? Do you want your audience to understand with a pretty, rounded explanation of your research? And that's really what we're looking for when we're talking about research summaries, is you want to give them sort of that big picture, but you also want to get a little more detailed, because of course we're talking about an audience that is specifically seeking out information on your research. I was reading through a lot of materials about writing research summaries specifically, and I thought one really great tip that I wanted to bring up was what excites you personally. And so when you're writing, try to recognize what you might say if you were asked, about your research at a social setting. And in fact, one great tip is what you might want to do is, instead of beginning your writing process by putting pen on paper or typing on a keyboard, is maybe you want to dictate it. And the reason why is because it's much more conversational. And if you dictate something to yourself, my research is on X and Y, and this is why we're looking at it, and I became interested in this field because of this, then you're going to pick up that excitement, the reason why you got involved in this line of research. And that's really important to include in your writing. If that's not there, you're not going to capture your audience. So I always tell people, begin by what excites you personally, and that often will be in your introductory paragraph or so. Of course, you also have to think about the aspects of your work that appeal to your target audience. So it certainly would vary. If you're talking to a group of seniors, or if you're writing to a group of seniors, what is interesting to them is going to be very different than a group of fifth graders. And then, of course, the other big question is how much space you have. We already talked about the appetite of your readership, but the space is also an important issue. So, for instance, when writing research summaries, sort of the standard is 2 to 3 pages, and I would pose that 2 pages is probably the right amount of length. And so you need to kind of incorporate all of that into your thinking. And so kind of to walk you through the process that I tend to go through, this is a more simplified process, a more generic process of going through the writing steps. And, if I were writing an op-ed, there would be, there might be some interviews in there with various experts. There would be a ton of research. But this is the basics of the process, is that, first of all, you want to, get a good understanding. If you're writing a research summary, you probably don't need to do any research because you should be the expert already. But if you're writing for a more general audience and it's not a research summary, you'd have to start with the research analysis. You may have to do interviews, probably not. Number 2 step, which I think is one of the most important steps, is outlining. I'm a big believer in creating a roadmap for what I'm writing. And the good news is when it comes to things like research summaries, there is basically a roadmap already created, and we're going to show that to you in a minute. But outlining, to me, a good outline, in my opinion, is one that basically writes the article for you. So when you have a good outline, I often take pieces of that outline and incorporate that into my actual piece. And I think that's a really important step in making sure that you're concise, that you're approaching things in a logical order, and that you're putting the important information up front. Then I go into the writing process. I often suggest to people, when I'm writing, I try to write a first draft from start to finish without refining. I know there's some people who will write a paragraph and then they'll refine, and then they'll move on to paragraph 2. My personal taste is to write an entire piece at once and then go back and go through the refining process, because I think that getting it all on paper is important and crucial. But the most important step, I'd say even before outlining, I'd say, is the refining process. Because to me, this is where your writing really takes shape. That first draft is great. You've got something on paper, but you really need to make it, to clean it up, to fix it, to take those long sentences, cut them into small pieces, define any terms. Sometimes you're moving things all around. Sometimes that first draft may be a little bit backwards. You may get into the nitty gritty in that 3rd or 4th paragraph, and you really need to move it down a little bit further. So that refining process, to me, is really where you go from something that might be okay to something that is very functional and very good. And then the editing and proofing process. It's incredibly important. One of the programs that Americans for Medical Progress runs is a science writing course for high school students. And we have drilled into them over and over again the importance of editing your work and proofing it, maybe having somebody else proof it. Incredibly important. It's amazing how many typos you see in this day and age. The worst reception you can get is when you hand something to somebody, especially for a job application, and it's got errors in it, it's got bad punctuation, it's got misspellings, etc. So I can't, I know you all are at an incredibly high level in your careers, but that being said, that part of the process is incredibly important. And I would always advise having somebody else look at your work before you sort of finalize it. And then, of course, the submission and publication process, that, of course, varies depending on what you're writing. So I talked a little bit about outlining, but a couple of other things about why I think outlining is important. It organizes your thoughts. It helps you decide what must be said, but also what doesn't need to be said. Incredibly important. You have to edit yourself. You have to decide, do I really want to go down this rabbit hole? Do I really want to do a paragraph about this specific gene sequence? You have to make those decisions early. Otherwise, it's a mishmash and a lot harder to clean up at the end. As I said, it makes the writing process much easier. I've written op-eds where I basically outline the thing, and then the actual writing process might take 20 minutes because it's so outlined and so clear in my brain what I want to pull off. And then it also helps you come up with an analogy. Sometimes you need to make analogies in science. As a science writer, I only use them sparingly because I don't feel like they're always necessary. But when you have a good analogy that really connects the dots for your readers, it's incredibly helpful. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the use of analogies in science writing. Again, you don't need them in every single thing you write. I think people overuse them at times. And sometimes they're not incredibly accurate. You need to make sure they're relatively accurate, but also you need to make sure you're never going to find the perfect analogy. Otherwise, you'd be actually describing the thing that you're working on. So I've talked to several scientists who get really aggravated with the science writer who, they use this analogy that just wasn't right. But then when you look at it as a reader, you say, actually, it's a pretty good analogy. You're never going to find the perfect summary of what you're doing. So look for those things when determining when you need an analogy and when and how to use it. But also make sure they're universally relevant. And what do I mean by that? So recognize who your audience is. If I were, I'm over 50. So I've certainly watched TV on tube TVs. So if you're using an analogy of like a tube TV, this, the electoral system goes like this, people would be like, what are you talking about? Anybody under the age of 30 would say tube TV. So use certainly, that's an iPhone, by the way. Eduardo told me he thinks it looks like a refrigerator, but but use analogies that actually make sense to your audience. So if you're writing for fifth graders, don't talk about a butter churn or a tube TV. It's really important for that thing to be something that's recognizable to them and something that translates to them. I actually did some research on good analogies, and here's a few that I found, and there probably is some disagreement in the room. I'm not sure if all of these are perfect. So this top analogy is water pipes and their comparison to blood vessels. It's a pretty good analogy. Certainly the visuals match. The cell, a human cell compared to a factory, relatively decent analogy, not entirely accurate, but relatively good one. And then the third one is antidepressants and comparing those to what do you call them? Prosthetics. Thank you. For some reason, that word never sticks in my brain. I also think that's a good analogy because when we're often talking about antidepressants, we're talking about something that can help people out, but is not something that they rely on 100%. So I personally think those are relatively good analogies. Maybe not necessary ones. Maybe you don't need an analogy for an antidepressant, but certainly when you're explaining a cell, that's certainly a case where you might need one, or just explaining the very basic systems of blood flow. Also, I think sometimes analogies really work well when you're talking about things that aren't that similar. Too often, but I remember like 20 years ago when I was starting out in science writing, people would use computers for an analogy for the human brain. And nowadays, I think we all can agree that that's a little bit too basic. They really don't translate. But sometimes you want to point out those differences. You might say something like, unlike a computer system, the human brain is able to do this and do that, and that's where they differ. I think that sometimes explaining those differences helps people understand, the uniqueness of your work or what you've accomplished on top of what's already been done. So now to get a little bit into research summaries. This session is about science writing as a whole and translating for the public, but we specifically wanted to talk about research summaries and how to write a good one. So I think a good research summary certainly tells the story of your research. Isn't that what we're talking about here? Identifies the questions that your research hopes to answer. that it explains how your research will be applied. Incredibly important, and something that gets lost in science sometimes as we get real interested in the details, what we're studying in our lab, but we don't really talk about the big picture, which is when you're talking about basic science research, that is sometimes difficult, but we need to accurately reflect that in our work. How do we hope this will fit into the big puzzle? Certainly want to highlight some of the challenges, whether it's the challenge of the gap that exists, the gap that we're trying to fill, or the challenges that just exist in trying to prove your theory. This is the hurdle that we need to overcome to answer the questions we're trying to answer. Certainly, it's a status report on your current research, but also talking a little bit about your future plans. So when we were talking about this session yesterday, Eduardo talked about sort of the short-term plans in 5 years or so, but then also, what do you hope to accomplish beyond that? What are the questions you hope to be answering in the next 5 to 10 years from now? I already mentioned the length tends to be about 2 pages long. I personally think that's a good length. You want it to be relatively concise and free from typos. And then, you just simply want it to be well organized. You want it to have a logical order of things. So there is no one way to write a research summary or research statement, basically the same thing. But this is sort of when looking at several examples, this is the standard sort of outline that I tended to see, which is your introductory paragraph or so, general statement about your research, what's the premise, identifying the gap, what's the gap of knowledge that you're trying to fill, and then sort of quickly summarizing the short-term and long-term goals, which you'll get into a little bit later. Certainly the historical information about your interest area, I think that telling your story is incredibly important. And so sometimes that might be, I became interested in this line of research because of this experience I had, or this occurred in a lab where I worked. We found it fascinating and wanted to enter this new area of research. So I think that telling that story in your introductory area is something that will pull people in and make them understand why this is, why did you approach this area? Funding history, of course, is going to be important if your research statement is going to be used for the job application. And then typically an outline would include the current status of your research. And this would be the area where you really get into the nuts and bolts of what you're looking at currently. Current studies, whether you're running one or two, I would suggest you split those so it's clear you're talking about one project versus another. Of course, further explanation about how those fit into the field. Highlighting lab needs is crucial when we're talking about a job application, because they'll want to know if you're going to need specialized equipment that doesn't already exist. And then, of course, including any funding source information is also important, because if it's clear that you sort of have your financial plans mapped out, or if what your current funding situation is, that's important. And then finally, the final component of a good research statement tends to include those future plans, which often can be stated relatively briefly in 2 to 3 sentences, because of course you folks don't probably have the next 20 years of your research mapped out, but it is good to give an idea to those who are interested in possibly hiring you. What do you plan to be doing, not only when these current studies are done, but on into the future. So I think that's a crucial component. And a few final thoughts on research statements, and sort of looking at examples. Things that popped up into my mind was, of course, it's really important to acknowledge the efforts of others. If somebody was involved in a research paper that you published, or is involved in the current line of research you're working on, incredibly important to include, to name them, to give them credit for that work. I thought a really good tip that I came across was to highlight the possibility of future collaboration. So if you're joining, University Y, I would like to work with Eduardo at University Y in investigating this, because he's fairly knowledgeable in this area. We could collaborate nicely and share some resources. Important to focus on your research, not yourself. I've seen a few that do get a little, while telling your story is, I think, a critical component of a research statement, making sure that for the majority of the statement is about the actual research itself. Certainly identifying problems or hurdles you want to sort of undersell or oversell what you can accomplish in your lab. Again, I already talked about funding sources, and then to be a little more realistic, of course, suggesting that you're going to cure cancer in the next 10 years probably isn't a promise you should make. So making sure that your research statement actually sounds like a scientific document that's geared towards actual findings that could occur in the next 5 to 10 years is very, very important.